He had lost the love of his life and nearly forgotten how to feel until one freezing night, a woman collapsed outside his cabin, clutching her dying son. What began as a rescue would unravel a hidden connection from the past and lead to a love story no one saw coming. If you believe in second chances, quiet heroes, and the kind of love that heals, this story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe to Soul Moments Story for more heartwarming tales that stay with you long after the final word. Now let's begin. The snow was coming down in thick, slanted sheets as Garrett Cole tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his old pickup truck. The wipers screeched back and forth, struggling against the relentless Montana blizzard. A gust of wind slammed into the side of the truck, and Garrett instinctively leaned forward, squinting through the fogged-up windshield. He glanced at the small brown paper bag on the passenger seat, the asthma medication for Sophie. She had fallen asleep, wheezing tonight, her tiny chest rising and falling like fragile bellows. He had kissed her forehead and promised he'd be back soon, but the snow had come faster than the weather station predicted. Of course it had. Out here in the mountains, forecasts were polite suggestions. At best, Garrett's knuckles whitened as he eased the truck around a curve. Then his headlights caught something. No, someone just ahead. A vehicle skewed sideways on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking in panic, and beside it, a woman on her knees in the snow, holding what looked like a small child. Garrett slammed the brakes. The truck skidded sideways before it shuddered to a stop. Heart pounding, he threw open the door, boots crunching into the knee-deep snow. "Hey!" he called out over the wind. "Are you all right?" The woman didn't answer. Her body was trembling violently. Her coat unzipped her gloveless hands, cradling a boy no older than 6. His face was bluish lips, parted breath, if any so faint it was invisible in the cold. She looked up, eyes wild, soaked lashes frozen together. "Please," she choked, barely audible over the storm. "He's not breathing. I don't know what to do." Garrett didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees, brushing snow from the child's face. The boy's skin was ice cold, pulse faint to non-existent. Garrett's training from years ago, CPR certifications, fire rescue drills back in his younger days, came rushing back like muscle memory. "He's in shock," he muttered. "How long has he been out? I don't know, 15, maybe 20 minutes. He had trouble breathing, and then just collapsed." "Get in the truck," Garrett ordered, voice firm but steady. "Now." She hesitated. I said, "Now. He has a better chance inside." The woman scrambled to her feet and followed Garrett as he lifted the boy into his arms. The child was far too light bones, wrapped in a jacket that had long lost its warmth. Garrett's chest tightened as he bundled the boy into the truck's back seat, then slammed the door shut and ran around to the driver's side. As he pulled away from the shoulder tires barely gripping the icy road, the woman beside him whispered, "His name's Micah." Garrett nodded grimly, eyes on the road. "I'm Garrett. Hold him. Keep talking to him. We're going to the cabin. It's 10 minutes from here." Inside the cabin, Garrett moved like a man possessed. He set Micah on the worn leather couch near the fireplace, lit instantly with the strike of a long match. He retrieved a pot, filled it with snow from outside, and set it on the stove to boil. The woman Elena, he learned, sat beside her son, her arms wrapped around herself as though she could hold in the fear. Garrett returned with towels, warmed by the fire, pressing them against Micah's chest and hands. "He needs to breathe," Elena whispered, voice cracking. Garrett didn't answer. He was too busy turning the pot of boiling water into a makeshift steam tent, draping a blanket over Micah, and coaxing the warm vapor toward the boy's face. "Come on, kid," he muttered. "You can do this." Micah let out a weak cough, just a flutter, like a baby bird testing its lungs. Elena gasped. "Did you hear that?" Garrett nodded, jaw clenched. "He's fighting." They sat like that for minutes, that felt like hours watching, hoping. The fire crackled. Snow pelted the windows, and then a deeper breath, another and another. Micah opened his eyes, dazed, and looked up at Elena. Her hands flew to her mouth as sobs overtook her. She collapsed beside him, holding his face, his chest, as if she could fuse herself to his tiny form and protect him forever. "Thank God," she whispered. "Thank God." Garrett stood slowly, body stiff from kneeling too long on the cabin floor. He walked to the corner of the room, leaned against the wall, and let out a long, quiet breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Elena looked at him through her tears. "You saved him?" Garrett shook his head slowly. "I just got him warm. The rest, that was him." She stood, walked over, and did something that startled them both. She reached out and took Garrett's hand in hers. "Thank you," she said, voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to stop, but you did." Garrett stared down at their joined hands, then at the boy breathing softly on the couch. He hadn't saved a life in years. Not since the night he couldn't save his. He swallowed hard. "You can stay the night. Storm's not letting up any time soon." Elena nodded silently. Garrett turned away to stoke the fire, his mind spinning not from the storm outside, but from the quiet one reawakening inside him. He didn't know it yet, but tonight had changed everything. Elena awoke to silence. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. The sharp scent of pine smoke hung in the air, the soft crackling of a dying fire in the distance. Her body ached from sleeping upright on the edge of a narrow bed, and her lips were dry from the cold. Then she turned her head and saw Micah. He was sleeping soundly beside her, nestled beneath a thick quilt. His cheeks were flushed now, not pale and blue, his small hand curled against his chest like he used to do as a baby. Elena exhaled shakily and brushed his hair back. He was alive. The images from the night before flickered through her mind like a nightmare. She couldn't quite let go of his gasping the snow, the headlights cutting through the dark, and then him, Garrett. She sat up slowly. The room was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp on a rustic pine table in the corner. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. She wrapped the quilt tighter around herself and stood wincing as her feet met the cold floorboards. Micah stirred slightly. She kissed his forehead. "I'll be right back, baby," she whispered and padded toward the door. The cabin opened into a larger room with rough-hewn beams and a wide stone fireplace, where a fire had long since burned down to glowing embers. She saw him there. Garrett sitting alone at the kitchen table wrapped in an old flannel shirt, one hand wrapped around a mug of something steaming, the other flipping slowly through a worn photograph. He didn't look up. Elena hesitated, then cleared her throat gently. He raised his eyes, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. "Coffee's hot," he said, finally. "Help yourself." She stepped forward cautiously, eyes scanning the room. Everything was simple, built by hand. Wooden chairs, a stone hearth, shelves filled with mismatched mugs, jars of dried herbs. It wasn't much, but it was safe. She poured herself a mug. "Your cabin." Garrett nodded. "It's beautiful, in a rugged, slightly haunted kind of way." He cracked a faint smile, the first she'd seen. Haunted's not far off. Elena wrapped her hands around the warm mug and took a seat across from him. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but heavy. Like there were too many things neither knew how to say. Garrett broke the quiet. "First, how's the boy?" "Better than I expected. Breathing steady fever down. Her voice caught. "I honestly thought I was going to lose him last night." You almost did. He said it gently, not to scare her, but because it was the truth. You did the right thing pulling over. If you'd kept going. She nodded, tears threatening again. I thought I could make it to town. I didn't know how bad the storm would get. Garrett looked down at the photo in his hand again. Elena leaned forward slightly, trying not to intrude. But the picture was old, creased at the corners. It showed a young woman holding a baby girl standing in front of this very cabin. The woman's smile was wide, warm. The baby looked like Sophie. Your wife? Elena asked gently. Garrett's jaw tensed. He didn't answer right away. Then, her name was Rachel. She waited. Lost her 3 winters ago. Car went off the ridge on her way back from town. Black ice. She was bringing home Christmas lights, said we needed to make the place more cheerful. I'm so sorry, Elena said quietly. Garrett gave a dry chuckle. I used to think I could fix anything with my hands, but I couldn't fix that. Silence returned. But now it was filled with something different. Grief recognized. Pain shared. He looked at her. And you. What brings you and the boy out in a storm like that? Elena stared into her mug for a long time before answering. A mistake, mostly, I thought. Maybe if I got away, things would start to make sense again. After the divorce, the city felt too loud, too cruel. Micah needed fresh air. I needed silence. But I guess I didn't think it all the way through. Well, Garrett said, you found silence. This place is full of it. She smiled, but it faded quickly as she glanced toward the back room where Micah still slept. Thank you for what you did. I mean that. You didn't have to stop last night. You didn't have to bring us here. Garrett shrugged. There was a boy who needed breathing. That's all I saw. But it wasn't all he saw. Not anymore. He looked at her, not as the panicked woman from the snow, but as someone with tired eyes and hands that trembled from holding too much alone for too long. You both should stay until the storm passes. Might be another day or 2, he said. She hesitated, then nodded. Thank you. He stood up and walked to a small closet, pulled out an extra blanket and handed it to her. There's a spare mattress near the fireplace. I'll bring in more firewood. As he opened the cabin door, a gust of wind and snow burst through, and for a moment Elena shivered, not from cold, but from the feeling that something had just begun, something she hadn't planned for, something that could undo the months, years of silence she'd wrapped around her life like a shield. She turned back toward the fire, her son sleeping soundly in the next room, and as she sat there, alone, in the flickering warmth of a cabin that still smelled faintly of grief and pine, Elena realized they were not the only ones seeking shelter from the storm. The storm did not let up. By the 3rd morning, snow drifts had swallowed Garrett's truck tires whole, and the wind outside moaned like an old widow. But inside the cabin, there was a kind of hush, the kind that only exists between people who are slowly beginning to trust each other. Elena had stayed by Micah's side for most of the past 2 days, never straying far, but now, with his color returned, and a growing appetite that included 2 bowls of oatmeal and a request for more cinnamon, she finally stepped outside for a few breaths of air. The snow had softened overnight. It lay thick but quiet, clinging to every branch, every fence post, every memory this land had ever held. She turned toward the cabin and studied it with new eyes. The small porch, the smoke curling from the chimney, the sturdy door that had opened to save her son. Everything here had been touched by grief. Yes, but it had also been kept, preserved, like someone had tried to hold on to something precious, even as the world kept stealing pieces away. She walked around to the side of the cabin and found a small stack of wood, neatly chopped. A weathered stump sat nearby, with an old axe embedded into its center. And just beside it, half buried in snow, was a wooden carving. It was a bird. Wings half extended smooth from years of sanding, the kind of thing a father might make for his child, or a man might make when he needed to shape silence into something solid. Elena crouched beside it. She didn't touch it, only looked. Then she smiled. Inside, Garrett was stirring the fire, his daughter curled on the rug near his feet, drawing animals in a faded notebook. Sophie had barely spoken to Elena or Micah since their arrival, but she watched. Always watching, quiet, cautious, and wise. Beyond her years, Elena stepped back inside, stomping snow from her boots. "You carve birds, now?" she asked softly, a little humor in her tone. Garrett looked up. "Used to not so much anymore." She tilted her head. "Why'd you stop?" Garrett poked at the logs. Didn't seem like there was much worth finishing after a while. She didn't press further. There was something fragile in his words, like the embers he was coaxing to stay alive. Later that afternoon, while Garrett was out gathering more firewood, and Sophie sat, humming near the fire, Elena took something from her travel bag, a small parcel wrapped in fabric. It was something she had carried through 3 apartments, a broken marriage, and now this cabin in the mountains, a hand-stitched linen handkerchief. She'd made it years ago during one of Micah's long hospital stays, trying to occupy her hands while time stood still. It wasn't perfect. The stitching was uneven, and the floral pattern was a little faded, but it was the only thing she'd made with both patience and pain. In one corner, she had embroidered a single line: "May your heart never go cold again." That evening, just after supper, if you could call reheated stew and cornbread supper. Elena folded the handkerchief carefully and slipped it into the handle of the cabin's front door when Garrett wasn't looking. Note. No explanation, just a small, quiet fire of kindness. Garrett found it the next morning. He'd risen early, as always, fed the fire, checked the chimney. Then, as he stepped outside to assess the snow, he saw it frosted at the edges, tucked into the door, like a memory someone wanted him to notice, but not open too quickly. At first, he didn't move. He simply stared. He recognized the craft, the frayed stitching, the kind of attention no one had shown him in a very long time. He turned it over in his hands and read the words, "May your heart never go cold again." His throat closed, and for a long time, he just stood in the snow, breathing, remembering. The last person who had sewn anything for him had been Rachel, a tiny patch she'd fixed on his flannel shirt after he tore it. Building Sophie's crib, he had kept the shirt. Still wore it, even. Later that day, as Elena poured herself a cup of coffee and sat quietly at the table, Garrett walked over and placed the folded handkerchief beside her mug. "I found this," he said. She looked up at him, trying not to smile. "Did you?" He nodded. Then after a pause, "Thank you." She touched the fabric, smoothed its edge. "You saved my son. I just wanted to give something back." Garrett hesitated. Then with effort he said, "You already did." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. But from that moment forward, something changed. That night, Sophie crept into the small space where Micah slept. He was curled into the quilt, breathing softly. She knelt beside him and placed something under his pillow, a wooden bird. Wings half extended, the one from the yard. She didn't say a word. When Elena found it the next morning, she held it to her chest and felt something click gently into place. Not just gratitude, but belonging. Outside, the snow was beginning to melt in delicate patterns along the eaves. Inside the cabin, warmth wasn't just coming from the fire anymore. It was coming from small things. A handkerchief, a wooden bird, a moment shared in silence. Little fires of kindness burning back the cold. By the end of the week, the snow had stopped, but Garrett hadn't mentioned when Elena and Micah should leave. And Elena hadn't asked. They had slipped into something like a rhythm. Morning chores, quiet afternoons, soup simmering on the stove, and evenings spent near the fire. It wasn't normal exactly. It was something quieter. Something healing. Sophie began speaking more often, usually to Micah, who followed her around like a puppy. She showed him how to trace animal tracks in the snow outside, and taught him the names of the pine trees that lined the property. He listened with wide eyes and a reverence that only children give to other children they trust completely. Elena watched Garrett in those days, not just with curiosity, but with something more tender. He wasn't polished. There was nothing refined about his rough hands or the way he cleared his throat when emotions got too close. But he was solid, present, the kind of man who built things that lasted even if he didn't believe he could. She noticed how he never sat down to eat until Sophie had taken her first bite. How he always walked the perimeter of the cabin at dusk. How he kept an old photograph tucked in his wallet, worn and folded, but never thrown away. There was something sacred in the way he carried his grief, like he refused to let it turn bitter. It was Friday evening when Elena got the idea. She had been rummaging through one of her old travel bags when she found it a bag of yellow popcorn kernels, tucked between a tattered book of poetry and a half-used notepad. She stared at it for a long moment, then glanced at the small cast-iron pot Garrett kept on the back of the stove. That night, after Garrett went out to fetch more firewood, she got to work. She poured a small handful of kernels into the pot, added oil, and covered it with a lid. The first pop startled her, and Micah clapped his hands with delight. More kernels exploded one after another, filling the cabin with a warm, buttery scent. When the popping slowed, she poured the golden treasure into a bowl sprinkled in a touch of salt and caramel sugar she found in the pantry and wrapped it in a square of old newspaper. Then she tied the package with twine and placed it just outside the cabin's front door. She knocked softly, then hurried back inside before Garrett returned. Garrett nearly tripped over it. He bent down, confused, and lifted the small parcel. It was warm in his hands, fragrant and unmistakably familiar. He untied the twine slowly, and the scent hit him like a memory. Popcorn. But not just any popcorn. This was Friday night. Popcorn. The kind his mother used to make every week when he was a boy, before there was a microwave, before there was anything fancy. Just kernels oil, a pinch of salt, and the sweet aftertaste of being safe at home. His mother would place the bowl on the coffee table, and they would sit on the threadbare couch. Him, his older brother, and his father, who rarely smiled, but always stayed through the whole movie. It was his favorite part of the week. He hadn't thought about it in years, and someone Elena had known. He brought the parcel inside quiet as snowfall. Sophie was sitting on the rug curled up with Micah and a picture book. Elena looked up from the rocking chair, eyes meeting his. "You made this?" he asked. She nodded. He sat down, slowly, placed the popcorn in the center of the table, and broke off a piece. The caramel crunched softly between his teeth. Then he looked at her, and in a voice rougher than usual said, "How did you know?" Elena hesitated. "You mentioned it. The first night. You said your mom used to make it. I just thought maybe Friday night deserved something familiar." He didn't reply, not with words. Instead, he got up, walked into the back room, and returned a moment later with a small radio, an old dented thing with a frayed antenna. He twisted the dial until the static gave way to the soft notes of a country ballad. John Denver's voice floated into the room. "Take me home." Country roads. Elena felt her breath catch. Garrett sat back down, closed his eyes for a moment, and let the music fill the space between them. Then he looked at Sophie and said, "You know what we used to do when the popcorn came out?" She looked up curious. "We told stories. Ones we made up, whoever had the silliest ending won. Micah grinned. "Can I go first?" Garrett nodded, and just like that, the cabin filled with laughter. Silly stories about talking bears and runaway snowmen, crumbs of popcorn on the floor, Sophie resting her head on Elena's lap without noticing Micah falling asleep with his hand still in the bowl. Later, as the fire died down and the children were tucked into their beds, Garrett stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching the snow fall outside. Elena approached quietly. "I didn't mean to pry," she said. "You didn't." There was a long silence. Then he turned to her. "When I was a kid, I thought Friday night popcorn meant everything was okay, that whatever happened during the week, school fights, Dad's bad moods didn't matter, because we were all together again." Elena smiled, and tonight, Garrett looked at her eyes soft, but unreadable. "Tonight," he said, "felt like something I didn't know I missed." In the quiet of the cabin, Elena stood beside him, shoulder brushing his, just barely outside. The snow softened the world. Inside, something old had been returned, something small, golden and warm, just like popcorn on a Friday night. The sun returned 3 days after the storm. Not boldly, but with a soft shimmer that bounced off the snow in quiet apology for what had come before. The world had turned from white and gray to a kaleidoscope of blues and golds. Icicles hung like fragile chandeliers from the eaves of the cabin, and the trees stood tall again, shaking off their frozen cloaks. Sophie was the first to suggest they go outside. "Elena," she said, tugging gently at her sleeve, "Micah's never seen the bench." "The bench?" Elena asked. Sophie nodded. "The one under the big pine tree Daddy made it." Elena glanced at Garrett, who looked up from the kindling he was bundling by the hearth. He hesitated for a moment, then gave a short nod. "It's been a while." They made their way through the snow, now crusted over and sparkling like powdered glass. Micah trailed behind Sophie, tiny boots crunching with every step. Elena walked beside Garrett, in silence, both aware and oddly comforted by the natural rhythm that had settled between them. The path led them to the edge of the clearing, where a massive pine tree stood sentinel over a snow-dusted wooden bench. The bench had clearly weathered seasons. Its legs were sturdy but worn. One side of the backrest had split slightly. Pine needles blanketed the seat like a quiet offering. Elena touched it gently. "You built this." Garrett nodded. 12 years ago, before Sophie was born, Rachel used to sit here and read. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Elena looked around. The spot was perfect, secluded, peaceful, cradled by trees, and framed by the rising slope of the ridge. You could see half the valley from here if the snow didn't blur the edges. Micah climbed onto the bench, feet not quite touching the ground. Sophie sat beside him, her mittened hands folded neatly in her lap. "Want to help me fix it?" Garrett asked quietly. Elena turned to fix what the crack in the backrest. "It'll split worse by spring." She looked at him for a beat. "You want my help?" He gave a one-shoulder shrug. "You're here. Might as well make yourself useful." There was the hint of a smirk, and Elena smiled back. "You're lucky I like a challenge." Later that afternoon, Garrett pulled 2 chairs outside and set up a small makeshift work table. He brought out sandpaper wood glue clamps and a replacement panel he'd roughly cut earlier that year, but never used. Elena rolled up her sleeves and got to work, her fingers tracing the old crack in the pine slat like it was a wound. She understood. Together they sanded and measured, worked in steady rhythm. No music, no distractions, only the sound of the wind, the birds, the soft brush of sandpaper against wood. "You're not bad at this," Garrett muttered, after she lined up a brace with perfect alignment. "I used to help my grandfather fix furniture when I was a teenager." she said. "He taught me how to use a chisel before I knew how to drive." Garrett glanced at her, surprised. "You don't strike me as the woodshop type. You don't strike me as the poetic wounded rescuer type," she teased. He chuckled a short, real laugh. "Touché." The sun was dipping when they finished clamping the backrest and wiping off the excess glue. Garrett stood back and admired it. She'll hold Elena brushed sawdust from her jeans. Of course, he said, gesturing to the bench. "Any place people sit and feel safe is a she." Elena looked at him, brows raised. "That's the most romantic thing I've heard you say." He opened his mouth to respond, but then something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something deeper, more vulnerable. "She was sitting here the day we found out Sophie's lungs weren't right," he said, voice softer now, "Rachel. She didn't cry, just sat there. Said this bench was the only place that helped her breathe when the world got too loud." Elena said nothing. She simply sat on the bench, running her hand over the smooth edge they had just sanded. She patted the seat beside her. Garrett hesitated, then joined her. They sat in silence for a long while, watching the children throw snow at each other in the clearing below. "You know," Elena said, "this whole place, it's like a memory someone tried to build into the present." Garrett looked at her, curious. "I mean it," she continued. "Everything here, your tools, the way the floorboards creak, that old radio, it feels like you're holding on to time, like if you let go, she'll disappear." He didn't reply right away. "Then she already disappeared. I just didn't know where to put all the love." The wind whistled low through the trees. Elena reached out and placed her hand over his fingers, tentative but steady. "You put it in your daughter, in this bench, in the people you help without asking for anything back." He looked down at their hands, then back out toward the woods, and for the first time, Garrett didn't pull away. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Elena found herself back at the bench, drawn to it by something unspoken. Garrett joined her a moment later, bringing 2 steaming mugs of tea. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. And somewhere between the stillness and the snow, the distance between grief and grace grew smaller than ever before. In the hush of a pine-framed evening, 2 people sat on a bench they'd rebuilt together, not just with wood, but with trust. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt broken. The first Saturday after the storm felt almost like spring. A soft thaw loosened the snowpack, and droplets clung to pine needles like tiny glass pearls. Birds returned to the trees, chirping as if they had slept too long and were now racing to make up for the silence. Inside the cabin, the air was different too. Lighter. More open. Elena noticed it in the way Sophie hummed as she swept the floor, and the way Garrett lingered longer at the table after breakfast, sipping his coffee, rather than rushing off to chop wood. Even Micah seemed changed, his laughter louder, his footsteps braver. It was a morning full of small grace notes. Garrett had gone out early to check the ridge trail, and Elena stood at the kitchen counter peeling apples for a pie. Sophie had insisted they try baking. The girl had spoken of it with a determined seriousness that reminded Elena of herself, at 9, earnest, hopeful, hungry for creation. Micah played nearby with a handful of wooden animal figurines Garrett had carved long ago. Sophie watched him for a moment, then motioned for him to follow her. "Come see this," she whispered. They tiptoed toward the far wall of the cabin, where a low cedar chest sat tucked beneath the bookshelf. Elena glanced back, curious, but said nothing. Sophie lifted the lid, revealing what looked like an old collection of odds and ends blankets, a rusted lantern, a pair of worn gloves, and at the very bottom, a box. It was a plain wooden photo box, its hinges creaky, its surface scratched by time. "Daddy doesn't like to open it much," Sophie said softly. "But sometimes I look." Micah's eyes widened. Sophie opened the box. Inside were dozens of photographs. Most were black and white or faded to sepia with age. A few had writing on the back, though the ink had blurred over time. Elena, now watching from a distance, hesitated. She knew she should stop them, but something inside her whispered. "Wait." Sophie pulled out a photograph and held it up to the light. "This one's from when he used to be on the rescue team." Elena's body tensed. Sophie passed the photo to Micah, who immediately brought it to Elena. "Look, Mommy, that's him." Elena took the photo gently, more out of instinct than interest. But when her eyes focused, her heart stopped. It was a group shot, 7 people in heavy winter jackets, arms slung over one another, standing in front of a rescue vehicle. They all looked young, wind-burned alive, and near the center, half smiling, was Garrett. But what drew her breath away was something else. The date scrawled on the back, February 12th, 2006, Pine River Rescue. Her hands began to tremble. She knew that date. She knew it in her bones. It was the day she had fallen through the ice at Pine River, just past the bridge near her uncle's cabin. She had wandered too far during a family trip. The memory was hazy, a cracking sound, a plunge into freezing darkness, a voice yelling arms, pulling her up, warmth, wrapping her like a blanket. She had never seen the face of the man who saved her. He disappeared before her parents arrived, just a name mentioned in a brief report. Garrett Cole. She looked back at the photo. It wasn't just a group picture anymore. It was a window into the first time she had been given a second chance at life. And now, 20 years later, he had done it again. She felt lightheaded. She sat down on the edge of the hearth, still holding the photo. Sophie and Micah were chattering softly in the background, unaware of the storm suddenly rolling inside her chest. When Garrett returned that afternoon, sun-drenched and dusted with sawdust, Elena stood at the table, the photograph placed deliberately in front of her. He saw it before he saw her expression. His body stiffened. "Where'd you find that?" Sophie showed Micah the box. "I recognized the photo." He approached slowly. His face was unreadable. "You were one of the kids." "I was the kid," she said. "I fell through the ice at Pine River." "I was 12. A long silence. "I remember," he said. Finally. "You were half-conscious when I got to you. Your lips were blue. You kept whispering your mom's name." Elena nodded, eyes glistening. "And you wrapped me in a red flannel blanket and carried me back through the woods." Garrett sat across from her, running a hand through his hair. "I never thought I'd see you again. I didn't know it was you." "Until now," she whispered. "Garrett, you didn't just save Micah. You saved me once before." He stared at her for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Maybe that's why I stopped that night in the storm. Maybe some part of me remembered without realizing it." Tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet and unashamed. "You've been part of my life. Twice," she said. "Both times when I thought it might end." Garrett leaned back in his chair, breath unsteady. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything," she said gently. "I just needed you to know." They sat there for a while, the photo between them like a map. No one realized they'd been following. Later that evening, Elena tucked the photo into the inside pocket of her coat. Not to keep it, but to remember. She wasn't sure if she'd ever tell Micah the full story, or if she'd include it in the book she'd started sketching out in her journal. But for now, she would carry it with her as proof. Proof that destiny doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a man in a flannel shirt holding out his hand twice. In the stillness of the cabin, with firelight flickering against the log walls, Elena finally understood. Some people don't just pass through your life. Some are woven into it before you ever know their name. The wind returned the next day, gentler this time, more a whisper than a howl. But Garrett felt it in his bones, not the cold, but a stirring, a kind of restlessness he hadn't known in years. Something had shifted since Elena showed him the photograph. He'd spent the night lying awake on the couch staring at the cabin's timbered ceiling, replaying her words again and again. "You didn't just save Micah. You saved me once before." He didn't know what to do with it. Gratitude made him uncomfortable. Grace even more so. By sunrise, he was out splitting logs again. The repetition helped. The clean crack of the axe through pine, the weight of each log hitting the wheelbarrow, the frost in the air that bit at his skin. Physical pain was always easier to understand than emotional weight, but as he loaded another stack onto the porch, he saw something that made him freeze. A truck familiar. Rusted idling at the edge of the property, Garrett dropped the last log and narrowed his eyes. He hadn't seen that truck in nearly 2 years. The driver's door creaked open. A man stepped out slower than Garrett remembered, wearing a worn Carhartt coat and a Dodgers cap that had seen better days. His father. Garrett didn't move. The man stood there in the snow, both hands stuffed into his pockets, eyes squinting against the light. "I heard you got snowed in," the older man said. His voice was rougher than Garrett recalled, rasping like sandpaper. Garrett folded his arms. "Don't recall asking for company." The man gave a tired nod. "Didn't come to be a bother. Thought maybe we should talk after all this time." Garrett said nothing. Inside, Elena had seen the truck. She stood just beyond the front door, unseen, but listening. Sophie and Micah were playing quietly by the fire, unaware of the tension thickening outside. "I don't need anything," Garrett said. Finally. "Not money, not help. Not explanations." The old man took a breath. "I know." "Then why are you here?" His father hesitated. "Because I'm tired of carrying it." Garrett looked away. His jaw tightened. The words stirred too much. The years of silence, the whiskey-fueled arguments, the night his mother walked out with a suitcase and never came back. "I lost your mother," the man continued, voice cracking. "Then I lost you. And the girl. I deserved that, I know I did. But I've been sober 3 years now. Doesn't fix the past. But it's all I got." Garrett felt the words hit somewhere. Deep somewhere. "Bruised. You can't just show up here after all that time," he said quietly. "Not after Rachel died. Not after Sophie asked me why her grandpa never sends cards." The man looked down. "I know." There was a silence so sharp it cut through the wind. Then something shifted. Elena stepped outside. She didn't say a word, just walked up beside Garrett and gently placed a hand on his forearm. Her presence didn't demand, didn't interfere. It simply reminded him, "You're not alone anymore." Garrett turned back to his father. "You want to talk," he said. "Fine, but you listen first." The man nodded slowly. Garrett took a breath. "You hurt us for years. You drank through birthdays and holidays, and every time Mom cried in the kitchen. And when she left, I thought maybe you'd get better. But you didn't. You got meaner. And I swore I'd never let my daughter grow up like that." His voice broke on the last word, but he didn't stop. "I loved Rachel. She brought light into this place. And when I lost her, I needed you just once, to sit next to me and say something. Anything, but you didn't. You vanished." The old man swallowed hard. "I didn't know how." "Well," Garrett said, stepping back, "learn." And then, Without fully knowing why, he opened his arms. The man hesitated, then stepped forward, and for the first time in more than 20 years, father and son embraced. It was not graceful, it was not eloquent, but it was real. And in that embrace, something ancient and bitter began to thaw. Later, as the truck drove away and the cabin door closed behind them, Elena poured 2 mugs of tea. Garrett sat at the table, his shoulders lower than usual, his face unreadable. "That was brave," she said gently. He shook his head. It was overdue. Sophie tiptoed into the room, holding something in her hands, a small drawing of Garrett and the older man, stick figures under a snow-covered roof, a fire burning inside. She handed it to him. "He can come next Friday for popcorn night." "If you want." Garrett stared at the picture, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe he can. Forgiveness doesn't always come like lightning. Sometimes it arrives like firewood." Split slowly stacked, carefully, warming the coldest corners of your life, one ember at a time. Snow began to fall again on Christmas Eve this time, soft, gentle, like a memory returning home. The cabin had never seen a Christmas quite like this. Not since Rachel Garrett knew it, the moment he stepped onto the porch and saw the handmade paper lanterns hanging from the eaves, swaying in the winter breeze. There must have been 20 of them, some round, others folded into delicate star shapes, glowing from small, flickering candles within. Warm light danced across the porch, the snow, the wood grain of the door, as if the cabin itself had come alive again. He turned to Elena, standing beside him with a box of matches and a dusting of snow in her hair. "Did you do all this?" he asked, his voice low. She gave a soft shrug, lips curving. "Me and the kids. Micah insisted on the blue ones. Sophie wanted stars." Garrett swallowed hard. He hadn't decorated for Christmas since Rachel's last one, hadn't had the heart. The boxes had stayed in the attic. Untouched, Christmas had become a day of silence, not celebration, but tonight. Something was different. Elena handed him a match. "Want to light the last one?" He took it without a word. Their fingers brushed just briefly, but it felt like fire. Inside the cabin smelled of cinnamon firewood, and the kind of roast you only make when there's something to celebrate. Sophie had set the table with unmatched plates and pine cones dipped in glitter. Micah had drawn a crayon sign taped to the wall that read, "Our first real Christmas." Garrett sat at the head of the table, stunned into stillness by it all. He'd never seen the cabin like this. Alive, bright, filled with laughter, instead of echoes. Elena sat across from him, glowing in the lantern light, her eyes soft as she watched the children. Dinner passed in a blur of stories, second helpings, and quiet smiles. No one talked about the past. There was only now, and it was enough. After dessert, Garrett reached into the cabinet above the hearth and pulled out an old wooden box. Inside was something he hadn't touched in 3 years, a worn vinyl sleeve, the cover frayed at the edges. He walked over to the small record player in the corner, Rachel's favorite, and placed the needle gently on the record. Crackle a breath, and then, "Have yourself a merry little Christmas." The room fell silent. Elena looked up, startled by the music. Garrett's throat tightened, but he stayed still. He remembered Rachel humming this song as she decorated cookies, how she used to hold Sophie in her arms and waltz around the kitchen, singing just a bit off-key, how her eyes sparkled when she made Christmas happen in even the hardest years. Garrett glanced at his daughter, now almost 10, and suddenly saw Rachel in the way her nose crinkled when she laughed. Elena reached for his hand. "I found something," she said gently. She rose, crossed the room, and picked up a small wrapped bundle hidden behind the bookshelf. She handed it to him shyly, as if unsure it would be welcome. He opened it slowly. Inside was a hand-bound manuscript, its cover soft linen, the title embossed in gold ink. The Man in the Snow, by Elena Harper Hart. Looked up at her confused. "I didn't write it to publish," she said quickly. It's just for you. For Sophie. For Micah." Someday, he opened to the first page. He appeared through the storm, just a man with a truck and quiet eyes. But he carried with him warmth and kindness, and the strength to lift a world from its knees twice. Garrett's breath caught. He closed the book and held it in his hands like something fragile. Something sacred. "No one's ever written about me," he said. Elena smiled. "Then it's about time." Later that night, after the children were tucked into their beds beneath quilts and whispered dreams, Garrett stepped outside alone. The lanterns still glowed. The snow had stopped. He stood there for a long time, listening to the silence, holding the book close to his chest. He didn't hear the door open behind him, but he felt her presence when Elena joined him. She slipped her hand into his. "They would have loved this," she said quietly when he nodded. She would have turned every lantern into a wish. Elena tilted her head. "Did you make one?" Garrett looked at the flickering lights. Then softly he whispered, "I wish this doesn't have to end." Elena leaned her head on his shoulder. "Maybe it doesn't." That night, as the lanterns swayed gently in the wind, the cabin no longer felt like a place haunted by what once was. It felt like home, because sometimes all it takes to bring a place back to life is one light, then another, then another, until even the darkest winters glow. The morning after Christmas arrived soft and silver, blanketing the world in a kind of hush that only comes once or twice a year. The kind of hush that made you believe the world had paused, just for a moment to breathe. Inside the cabin, the warmth lingered, not just from the fire, but from something deeper, something unspoken that now hung in the air between Garrett and Elena, like the last note of a song neither of them wanted to end. They moved around each other in the kitchen, comfortable quiet. Sophie and Micah were still asleep, tangled in blankets full from cocoa and the magic of the night before. Garrett poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to Elena. Their fingers touched as she took it, and neither pulled away. "You didn't sleep much," she said softly. He shook his head. Too many thoughts. Not enough room for them. Elena took a slow sip, her eyes studying his. "Want to walk it off?" He looked at her, then out the window at the glistening snow. "Yeah," he said, "I think I do." They followed the path past the woodpile and down the ridge through the pines, glazed with frost. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and their breath puffed out in white clouds. It was quiet, but not awkward. It was the kind of silence that held weight, that made room for something meaningful. When they reached the clearing where the bench stood still solid from their repairs, they stopped. Garrett brushed the snow from the seat and motioned for her to sit. Elena hesitated only a second, then lowered herself beside him. For a while they simply looked out at the trees. Then Garrett spoke, voice low. "Do you believe in fate?" She turned to him. "I used to. Then I didn't. Then I think I started to again." He nodded slowly. "I've tried to make sense of it all." He continued. "Losing. Rachel. Raising. Sophie alone. Getting lost in grief. I thought maybe that was it. My life reduced to a survival story." He paused. Then one night in a snowstorm, there was this woman crying in the dark, holding a dying boy. And I didn't know it then, but I had already met her once. Years ago when I pulled her from a river and walked away thinking I'd never see her again. Elena's eyes glistened. She reached for his hand. Garrett looked down at their joined hands, his voice rough with emotion. I thought I'd used up whatever good was left in me. That love was something I didn't get to feel again. But then, you came back into my life. Not once. Twice. And it didn't feel like fate anymore. It felt like forgiveness. Elena swallowed hard. I spent years convincing myself I didn't need anyone. That love wasn't worth the risk. That Micah was enough, and he is. But you showed me that maybe I don't have to do it alone. Garrett turned toward her, the winter light catching in his eyes. Say it, he whispered. What? That it wasn't just me. She smiled through tears. It wasn't just you. And then finally, impossibly beautifully, he leaned in. Their lips met in a kiss that was not rushed, not desperate, but deep and sure. It held grief and gratitude, memory and longing. It held all the words they hadn't dared speak, and all the ones they never needed to. It was the kind of kiss you only give once life has stripped everything else away and left only what matters. When they pulled apart, Elena rested her forehead against his. I didn't come here to fall in love, she whispered. Garrett gave a quiet laugh. I didn't plan to save the same woman twice. They stayed there on the bench, hand in hand. Hearts opened like windows that had been sealed for too many winters. That night, as the fire crackled low and the children slept soundly, Garrett opened the manuscript Elena had given him again. He turned to a page he hadn't seen before. In it, she described the way the man in the snow had stood, not like a hero, but like a man who had failed and kept going anyway. How he hadn't just rescued others, he had rescued himself by learning to feel again. And in the margin in her own handwriting, she had scribbled, "Sometimes we return not to places, but to people who once saved us. And this time we stay." Outside, the pines stood tall beneath a sky full of stars. Inside two hearts once frayed by loss, beat in time again, steady and strong. And in a small cabin in the cold, love returned with fireworks, but with one quiet kiss beneath the snow. January arrived with a sky the color of pearl and snow that fell soft as breath. The world beyond the cabin had begun to move again. Roads plowed, power restored, but none of them were in a rush to leave. Each morning, Garrett still chopped wood. Elena still made coffee. Sophie and Micah played beneath pine trees and fed the birds with crusts of homemade bread. But now something had shifted. Where once there was caution, now there was comfort. Where once there was silence, now there was presence. Where once there were visitors, now there was a home. Garrett had begun building a new bench with Micah. Elena had taken over the small bookshelf by the window and filled it with her journals, a few classics, and picture books wrapped in tape and memory. Sophie asked to learn how to carve. Every day something small deepened. Then one morning, Garrett returned from a supply run in town and found a folded note taped to the back door. The handwriting was unmistakable. Blocky, determined with letters slightly slanted from a child still learning the art of spelling. For Dad, from Sophie. But you have to wait until the sun goes down. He raised an eyebrow, amused. Elena only smiled. Don't ask me, she said. Trying not to laugh, I was sworn to secrecy under threat of tickle torture. That evening, as dusk melted across the snow like watercolor, Sophie appeared at the edge of the porch, wearing her best flannel dress, her hair tied in uneven braids. Garrett stepped outside, boots crunching against the frost. "What's this about?" he asked. Sophie held out her hands behind her back. "Close your eyes," he chuckled. "You know I don't like surprises. You'll like this one." He closed his eyes. Sophie pressed something into his hand, light, warm, and smooth. When he opened his eyes, he stared down in disbelief. It was a ring, not gold, not silver, but carved beautifully lovingly from a piece of polished pine, smoothed and rounded into a perfect circle. Along the inside were small letters scratched in with painstaking care, "Because she makes you smile again." Garrett swallowed hard, his chest tightening with something beyond words. Sophie looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can't give you a real wedding ring, but I thought, maybe this is better, because you made it through everything, and because you love her." Garrett knelt, eyes wet. "Where did you learn to carve like this?" She grinned. "I watched you every day, and I asked Elena to help with the sanding." He looked at the ring again, then up toward the cabin, where Elena now stood in the doorway, watching. Her eyes met his across the porch light. "She's not just someone passing through." "Dad," Sophie said quietly, "I think she was meant to find us." Garrett pulled his daughter into a hug and held her there, and in that moment the grief that had once choked him loosened its grip, not erased, but transformed. That night, with a fire flickering in the hearth and the scent of cedar rising from the logs, Garrett took Elena's hand and led her outside beneath the starlit porch. "You're not going to ask me to chop wood, are you?" She teased, her breath visible in the cold. "No," he said, reaching into his pocket. "But I'm going to ask you something else." He held up the wooden ring. It glowed in the lantern light, humble but beautiful. Elena gasped softly. "I know it's not traditional," he said, "and I know it doesn't sparkle, but it's made of this place, and of the people who matter most. And it's the only kind of promise I know how to make honest, quiet, and lasting." She stared at him, eyes full. Garrett knelt down in the snow. "Elena Harper, would you stay? Would you keep building this life with us? It won't be perfect, but it will be real, and it'll be yours." Elena covered her mouth with both hands, overwhelmed. Then she nodded once, twice, tears already spilling. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit like it had always been meant for her. And then he stood, and they kissed again. Not like people trying to start over, but like people who finally understood where home had been waiting all along. Later that night, as they told the children the news, Micah jumped up and cheered. Sophie simply smiled, as if she had known it would happen all along. Garrett built a small fire on the bench beneath the pines, and they all sat around it, in blankets and wool socks, sipping cider and telling stories. It wasn't a wedding. It wasn't formal, but it was sacred. And in the warmth of that firelight, something even deeper took root. Not just love, not just healing, but the start of a family. Not all rings are made of gold. Some are carved from memory, shaped by loss, smoothed by time, and when slipped onto the right finger beneath a sky full of stars, they shine just the same. 1 year later, the cabin had changed. Not in its structure, it still leaned slightly on the east wall. The floor still creaked in winter, and the chimney still coughed on the first cold morning of the season. But in its soul, the cabin was alive now. Not just a shelter, but a sanctuary. Garrett stood on the porch with a mug of coffee in hand, watching the early snow fall. The sky had just begun to lighten, casting the woods in a soft, blue hush. Behind him he could hear faint laughter. Sophie and Micah squabbling over mittens, Elena humming in the kitchen as she stirred something warm on the stove. A year ago he had stood here too, alone, haunted, carrying more silence than words. Now his heart was full. Not perfect, not polished, but full. Down the path, the old bench beneath the pines sat sturdy and snow-dusted. It had become their favorite spot, his and Elena's. It was where they went to dream, to talk about the future, and sometimes to say nothing at all. By noon, the cabin was buzzing. Elena had sent out invitations weeks ago, handwritten on recycled paper, sealed with sprigs of dried pine, and tied in twine. No email, no RSVP, just an open call to the community. And they came. People from the valley, retired teachers, single mothers, widowed veterans, children bundled in bright scarves and old boots. Some had heard whispers about the woman who wrote a book about a man who saved her life twice. Others simply followed the scent of fresh bread and something rare. Welcome. The living room had been cleared to make space. Garrett had built folding benches from scrap wood. Sophie had painted a sign that hung above the hearth. Winter gathering, everyone welcome. And they meant it. A wood-burning stove kept the room warm. Candles flickered in old mason jars. Someone started strumming a guitar, and soon old folk songs drifted through the cabin, joined by laughter and the clink of mugs. Elena stood at the center, wearing a soft green sweater and an apron dusted with flour. She was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with makeup and everything to do with peace. She had published her book last spring, The Man in the Snow. Not with fanfare, but with truth. It wasn't a bestseller, but it made its way into hands that needed it. Letters had come from across the country, readers, thanking her for reminding them that hope could be quiet, that kindness could be redemptive, and that love didn't always begin with fireworks. Today she wasn't signing books. She was pouring cider, wiping noses, tucking extra cookies into coat pockets. She was home, in the corner. Garrett was teaching 3 boys how to plane a piece of maple without splintering the grain. He had opened up a free winter woodworking class in the cabin 2 months earlier, just a few Saturdays at first. But word spread. People stayed. Now he taught retired ranchers how to carve spoons, and single dads how to build shelves for their daughters' books. His hands, once used only to repair what was broken, now created new beginnings. From across the room, Elena caught his eye. He smiled. Later, after the guests had thinned and the cider had cooled, Garrett slipped out the back door and made his way to the bench beneath the pines. It was quiet again. Still, the trees stood tall, guardians of memory and mercy. Elena joined him a few minutes later, her gloved hand slipping into his without a word. Together they sat, watching the snowfall, listening to the hush. You ever think he asked softly about how it all started? Elena leaned her head against his shoulder. Every day, a broken truck, a dying child, a storm, and a man who stopped when he didn't have to, she said. He looked down at her, his eyes soft. I think we saved each other. She nodded. I think we still are. They sat like that until the sky darkened, until the cabin behind them lit up like a lantern in the woods. Children's laughter spilled out the windows as it returned. Life went on. But slower now. Kinder full of small miracles. Years from now, people would still talk about the cabin in the cold. Not because of the storm or the book or even the love story, but because in a world that often rushed past its own heart, someone had stopped. Someone had stayed. And from that one act of kindness, a whole life grew. Love had come in quietly, warmed its hands by the fire, sat down at the table, and never left again. The cabin hadn't changed the world, but it had changed theirs. And that was enough. Before you go, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Leave us a comment below and share your thoughts. Your stories mean the world to us. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to Soul Moments Story. We share true and fictional tales of love, kindness, and second chances. Stories that gently remind us what truly matters, from our heart to yours. Thank you for watching and spending time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and take care.